When a young boy is abandoned on the edge of a wildlife reserve, a lion named King emerges from the tall grass, drawn to the sound of his cries. This mighty predator, known for his dominance in the wild, locks eyes with the terrified child. Letting out a deafening roar, King charges toward him, his massive paws kicking up clouds of dust. What happens next is nothing short of extraordinary. The morning sun had just begun to rise over the vast, untamed wilderness of the Seren Wildlife Reserve. The air was cool and crisp, carrying with it the distant sounds of birds and the soft rustle of trees swaying in the breeze. Miles of golden grass stretched endlessly, interrupted only by dusty dirt roads that cut through the reserve like quiet veins. On one such road, a small figure sat alone, huddled and trembling. It was a young boy, no older than 5, shadowing his tear-streaked face as sobs racked his tiny body. His cries, loud and desperate, echoed across the still landscape. There was no one else around, no cars, no people, just the lonely emptiness of the wild. From the tall grass just beyond the road, another figure stirred. King, a massive lion, awoke from his slumber. The morning was when lions were most active, taking advantage of the cooler air before the harsh midday heat set in. King stretched lazily, his enormous paws digging into the earth as his golden mane shimmered in the soft morning light. His stomach let out a low growl, a reminder that it was time to hunt, but something stopped him. Carried on the breeze was an unusual sound, sharp, piercing, and entirely out of place. King's ears twitched, his amber eyes narrowing as he lifted his head to listen. It wasn't the sound of prey or of other lions. It was crying. The lion sniffed the air, catching a scent that was equally foreign, human. Intrigued, King rose to his full height, his powerful frame cutting an imposing figure against the horizon. With silent, purposeful steps, the great lion began to move. The boy's cries grew louder as he sat in the middle of the dirt road, his small hands wiping at his red, swollen face. His sobs came in shuddering gasps, the kind that only comes from the pure fear of being alone. The soft earth beneath him was cold, the wind biting against his small frame. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, caused the boy to pause. From the tall grass, King emerged, his enormous form casting a long shadow across the road. The sight of the lion froze the boy in place. His cries stilled, replaced by a wide-eyed look of terror. King's powerful muscles rippled with every step as he moved forward, his paws barely making a sound against the dusty ground. The lion stopped just a few feet away, his piercing eyes fixed on the boy. He lowered his head slightly, sniffing the air as if trying to make sense of this strange creature before him. The breeze rustled his mane, giving him an even more regal and fearsome appearance. And then he roared. The sound was deafening, low and thunderous, a primal warning that seemed to shake the earth itself. King bared his teeth in a display of raw power, his golden eyes blazing with intensity. The boy flinched but couldn't look away, his small body rooted to the spot. For a moment there was nothing but silence. The boy stared into the lion's eyes, tears still clinging to his cheeks, and something strange happened. Instead of seeing an untamed predator, the boy saw understanding. It was as though King recognized something familiar in the child's sorrow, a memory perhaps of his own helplessness as a cub. King began to pace. The massive lion walked in slow, deliberate circles around the boy, his tail flicking in agitation. His movements were neither aggressive nor calm. Something about the situation seemed to unsettle him. King growled softly, a sound that rumbled in his chest like a distant storm. Each time the boy's cries grew louder, King seemed to grow more restless, his steps quickening and then slowing again, back and forth like a pendulum. And then King stopped. His ears perked up as a new sound drifted on the breeze, a rustle from behind the tall grass. King's nose twitched, catching a fresh scent, and his hackles raised. His head snapped toward the source, his entire body going rigid as his muscles coiled like springs. The boy didn't notice the change right away. He was still sitting frozen, overwhelmed by the presence of the lion. But before he could comprehend what was happening, King released another ear-splitting roar, one filled with anger and urgency. In an instant the lion charged, and the massive beast sprang forward, his powerful legs kicking up clouds of dust as he raced toward the boy. For a heartbeat, it seemed as though King was attacking him, and the child shrank into himself, bracing for impact. But King leaped, soaring over the boy's head with a speed and grace that defied his size. A terrible thud followed, the sound of two bodies colliding in a clash of claws and roars. Startled, the boy turned to see another lion, a smaller but equally dangerous rival, now pinned beneath King's immense weight. King stood over the intruder, snarling and swiping with his massive claws, his roars echoing through the reserve. The boy sat stunned, watching as the two lions fought just feet away from him. And that's when the sound of an engine rumbled in the distance. From the other side of the road, a jeep barreled forward, kicking up a trail of dust as it sped closer. Daniel, the wildlife ranger, had been patrolling the reserve and had seen something on the road. When his eyes fell on the unbelievable scene ahead, two lions locked in a fight and a young boy sitting mere feet away, his heart dropped into his stomach. Slamming his foot on the gas, Daniel raced toward the child, his mind frantic with questions. How did a child end up here? And what was King doing? As Daniel neared, he watched in shock as the second lion freed itself from King's hold and limped back into the tall grass, defeated. But what happened next nearly made Daniel lose control of the jeep. King, the mighty lion, turned back to the boy. Instead of leaving, he lay down beside him, his massive body forming a shield around the child. King's eyes scanned the area, as though ensuring no further danger approached. Daniel brought the jeep to a screeching halt, his heart pounding as he took in the sight. The lion wasn't threatening the boy. He was protecting him. The ranger's hands tightened on the steering wheel, his mind reeling. He had raised King from a cub, but he had never imagined anything like this. In the distance, Daniel, the wildlife ranger, pulled his jeep to a stop. The sight before him sent a chill through his veins, a helpless child sitting in the middle of the road, and King, the largest lion on the reserve, stretched out beside him like a silent guardian. Daniel's years on the reserve had trained him for every conceivable scenario, but this was beyond anything he'd ever encountered. Gripping the wheel, Daniel struggled to process what he was seeing. Why isn't King attacking? Why is he protecting the child? The lion's posture was relaxed but alert, his tail flicking against the ground in slow, rhythmic beats. Liam, still wide-eyed, sat quietly, as though he instinctively understood that King meant him no harm. Daniel took a deep breath and cut the engine, silence flooding back over the landscape. The ranger had always felt a strange connection with King. Having rescued the lion as a cub and nurtured him back to health, Daniel had seen the lion grow from a fragile, orphaned baby into one of the most dominant creatures on the reserve. But today, King was showing something Daniel hadn't thought possible: a sense of understanding, of empathy. Daniel's hands shook slightly as he opened the jeep door and stepped out. The dry earth crunched under his boots, the sound echoing through the stillness. He glanced warily at King, who immediately turned his head toward him. Their eyes met. For a moment, Daniel froze, feeling the full weight of King's gaze. The lion stared at him as though assessing his intentions. It was the same look he gave to rival lions or unfamiliar creatures, a piercing stare that held the promise of both strength and restraint. Daniel held up his hand slowly, showing he meant no harm. "It's me, King," Daniel murmured under his breath, his voice steady but soft. "It's me, buddy." The lion's ears flicked in recognition, though he didn't move. Slowly, Daniel edged closer to the child, keeping his movements deliberate and calm. "Hey there, little guy," he called gently to Liam. The boy's tear-streaked face turned toward him, eyes still wide with confusion and fear. Liam didn't say a word, but the sound of another human voice seemed to stir something in him. Daniel took a cautious step forward, his eyes flicking to King, who hadn't budged. The lion still lay beside Liam, his enormous paws stretched out in front of him like a silent sentinel. When Daniel was just a few feet away, King did something unexpected. The lion let out a low, rumbling growl, not aggressive, but a clear warning. Daniel froze mid-step, his heart pounding. King wasn't ready to let anyone near the child yet, not even the ranger who had saved him. "All right, big guy," Daniel whispered, trying to stay calm. "I get it. You're protecting him." King's growl softened and his gaze turned back to the horizon, scanning for any unseen threats. Daniel exhaled slowly, his mind racing. There was no way he could approach Liam while King was still in full protector mode. He needed to wait, to give King time to assess the situation. Minutes passed in tense silence. Daniel stayed where he was, his muscles tight, watching King for any sign of aggression. But the lion remained calm, occasionally glancing at the ranger as if to confirm he wasn't a threat. Then something shifted. King let out a long, deep breath and slowly stretched, his massive paws extending as he rose to his full, impressive height. He turned his head to Daniel once more, his amber eyes locking onto the ranger's. It was a silent exchange of trust, one that only years of familiarity could have built. Finally, King took a step back. The lion's slow retreat was graceful and deliberate, as though he were giving Daniel permission to approach. He didn't leave completely. He remained close, standing just a few feet away, his presence still looming large over the scene. Daniel didn't waste the opportunity. He stepped forward quickly but carefully, crouching down in front of Liam. The boy flinched at first, but Daniel smiled reassuringly, his voice calm and steady. "Hey there, buddy. You're all right now," Daniel said softly. "I'm here to help." Liam stared at him for a long moment, his little face streaked with dirt and tears. Slowly, he reached up and rubbed his eyes, sniffling as he tried to process what was happening. "You're safe now," Daniel reassured him, glancing at King, who was watching intently from a distance. "See? Even the big guy's looking out for you." Daniel gently scooped Liam into his arms, cradling the boy against his chest. Liam let out a small whimper but didn't fight him. The child was exhausted. His sobs had quieted, and he nestled into Daniel's shoulder, seeking comfort. As Daniel turned back toward the jeep, he cast one last glance at King. The lion stood still, his golden mane swaying slightly in the breeze. For a moment, Daniel swore the lion's gaze softened, as though he were satisfied that the child was now safe. "Thank you," Daniel whispered, his voice barely audible. King watched as Daniel climbed into the jeep with Liam in his arms. The vehicle rumbled to life, its engine breaking the fragile silence of the morning. As Daniel drove away, he looked in the rearview mirror and saw King still standing in the middle of the road watching them leave. The ranger's mind was spinning. How had this happened? What had compelled King to protect the boy? Daniel thought back to the day he'd found King as a cub, lost, scared, and alone. Somehow he felt that King had seen himself in the child's tears, as though some primal instinct had driven him to act. Liam stirred in his arms, drawing Daniel's attention back to the present. "You're going to be okay," he murmured softly to the boy, brushing a lock of hair away from his face. "We'll figure this out." The jeep rumbled across the dirt road, its tires kicking up faint trails of dust as it moved deeper into the Suren Wildlife Reserve. Inside the vehicle, Daniel kept one hand steady on the wheel, while the other gently supported the boy, Liam, who had fallen into an exhausted sleep. The child's face, still streaked with dried tears, was calm now, nestled against Daniel's chest. The morning light filtered through the trees, casting soft shadows across Daniel's face. His mind raced as he tried to piece together what had just happened. His years as a wildlife ranger had shown him many incredible sights, but nothing came close to what he had witnessed today. A lion protecting a human child. It defied everything he knew about animal instincts. And yet he couldn't deny what he had seen. His eyes darted briefly to the rearview mirror where King still lingered in the distance. The lion stood like a statue, his golden mane catching the sunlight as he watched the retreating vehicle. For a fleeting moment, Daniel swore the lion's expression held something beyond primal instinct, something almost human. Daniel's grip on the wheel tightened as a wave of memories swept over him. Years earlier, King had come into Daniel's life in the most unexpected way. Daniel had only been 22, fresh-faced and brimming with enthusiasm when he first joined the Wildlife Reserve's ranger team. He had grown up with a deep respect for animals, and the Suren Reserve felt like his calling. It was a sanctuary, a safe haven for wildlife in a world where poaching and habitat destruction loomed as constant threats. It had been during one of his routine patrols that Daniel first found King. The memory was still sharp, as though etched into his very being. Daniel had stumbled upon a heartbreaking scene deep in the reserve's grasslands. An adult lioness lay lifeless on the ground, surrounded by the remnants of poachers' careless destruction. The air was heavy with the scent of death, and nearby, nestled against her body, was a small, trembling cub. The cub's soft whimpers had been the only sound in the silence, echoing the despair of the moment. He was far too young to survive alone, barely old enough to walk, let alone hunt. Daniel knew instantly that if he left the cub there, he wouldn't make it through the night. Kneeling beside him, Daniel had whispered, "I've got you, little guy. You're not alone anymore." It was the first time Daniel had ever held a lion cub. He had wrapped the tiny creature in his ranger jacket and carried him back to the reserve's care center. The cub, whom Daniel later named King, had been weak and malnourished, his golden fur matted and dull. For weeks, Daniel had woken at all hours of the night to feed and care for him. King had clung to him, relying on the ranger's warmth and protection, as though he knew even then that Daniel was his savior. But Daniel also knew the importance of preparing King for life in the wild. He had seen other orphaned animals grow too dependent on humans, only to struggle once they were released. So, as soon as King was strong enough, Daniel made the difficult decision to introduce him to a lioness in one of the reserve's prides. She had just given birth to cubs of her own, a fiercely protective mother, yet gentle in her way. Daniel had watched with held breath as the lioness sniffed the unfamiliar cub. It could have gone so badly. But after a tense moment, she accepted King as one of her own, nuzzling him and leading him to her side. From that day on, King's life transformed. He grew strong under the lioness's watchful eye, learning how to hunt, fight, and survive. As the years passed, he became one of the reserve's most dominant males, ruling his territory with a mix of ferocity and grace. Snapping back to the present, Daniel glanced down at Liam, who stirred slightly in his sleep. Is that what King saw in him, Daniel wondered? Did he see himself in this little boy, alone, scared, and vulnerable? The thought gave him chills. It wasn't impossible. Animals, after all, were far more intelligent and empathetic than most people gave them credit for. King's actions this morning weren't just instinct. They were something deeper, something Daniel couldn't fully explain. As the jeep neared the reserve's main office, Daniel sighed. He had a lot of work ahead of him. Liam's presence here was a mystery that had to be solved, and the authorities needed to be informed. But more than that, Daniel felt a growing responsibility for the child, a responsibility that reminded him all too much of when he had first found King. Pulling into the main office, Daniel parked the jeep and carefully lifted Liam into his arms. The boy stirred awake, his small hands gripping Daniel's shirt as his eyes fluttered open. He looked around groggily, confusion still evident on his face. "It's okay, buddy," Daniel said softly. "We're somewhere safe now." Carrying Liam inside, Daniel placed him gently on a cushioned chair and grabbed a bottle of water. The child accepted it with small, trembling hands, taking a hesitant sip. Daniel watched him closely, his heart heavy. "Where did you come from?" Daniel murmured to himself, kneeling to the boy's level. "Lion," Liam whispered suddenly, his voice tiny but clear. He looked up at Daniel, his eyes wide and innocent, and let out a small roar to mimic the sound he'd heard earlier. Daniel couldn't help but smile, even as the weight of the situation pressed down on him. "Yeah, that was King," he said softly, brushing Liam's hair back. "He's a pretty special lion." The sound of a car engine outside broke the quiet. The authorities had arrived. Daniel stood, glancing out the window as the uniformed officers stepped out of their vehicle. He had already made the call during the drive back, explaining that a young boy had somehow found his way into the reserve. The officers were here to take over and figure out where Liam had come from and what would happen to him next. Daniel's chest tightened. He didn't want to let Liam go. The boy, so small and fragile, had already imprinted himself on Daniel's heart, just like King had all those years ago. As the door opened and the officers entered, Daniel turned back to Liam. The boy looked up at him, trust shining in his tear-filled eyes. "Don't worry," Daniel said, his voice steady and gentle. "I'll make sure you're okay." The office was small but cozy, filled with maps of the wildlife reserve pinned on the walls, shelves lined with worn books about animal behavior, and a radio crackling softly in the corner. The sunlight streamed in through a dusty window, bathing the room in a warm glow. Daniel sat at his desk, absent-mindedly running a hand through his short, dark hair as he watched Liam, the little boy now perched quietly in the chair across from him. The child looked small and fragile, his oversized blue jacket slipping off one shoulder as he clutched a half-empty water bottle. Despite the ordeal he had clearly been through, Liam had calmed considerably, though he still flinched at every sound outside the window, perhaps expecting to hear another lion's roar. Daniel's mind raced as the uniformed officers sat with him, notebooks open, scribbling furiously as they questioned him about the morning's events. "So, you're telling me the lion protected him?" One of the officers, Detective Carter, asked skeptically, his brows furrowing deeply. Daniel nodded, leaning back in his chair. "I know it sounds impossible, but yes. King didn't attack him. He protected him, fought off another lion to keep him safe." The officer exchanged a doubtful glance with his partner. "Wild animals don't do that." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Maybe not usually, but King isn't just any lion. I rescued him when he was a cub. There's something about him, something different. I know what I saw." The detective sighed and leaned forward. "All right, but that still doesn't explain how the child got there in the first place. You said he wasn't injured?" "No, dirty, scared and exhausted, but not harmed," Daniel replied. His voice softened as he glanced at Liam again, who was now staring blankly at the maps on the wall, his small fingers tracing invisible patterns on the chair's armrest. "We need to figure out who he is and where he came from," the detective continued. "Do you have any surveillance footage of the area where you found him?" Daniel's heart sank slightly. "Yeah, let me check." Daniel rose from his desk and crossed the room to a small laptop connected to the reserve's CCTV system. He hadn't yet reviewed the footage himself, but he hoped it would shed light on how Liam ended up in the reserve. The officers stood behind him as Daniel typed in the access code and pulled up the camera feeds. After fast-forwarding through several hours of quiet wilderness, Daniel froze as the screen flickered and showed a battered old car creeping into frame. His breath caught in his throat as the grainy footage revealed the scene in haunting detail. The car rolled to a stop near a weak spot in the reserve's fence. The driver, a young man, stayed in the car, his face obscured by the shadow of the vehicle. A few moments later, the passenger door opened and a woman stepped out carrying Liam in her arms. Daniel leaned closer, his chest tightening as the woman turned toward the camera. Though her face was blurry, her actions were heartbreakingly clear. She kissed Liam tenderly on the forehead before kneeling to push her way through the damaged fence, clutching the boy tightly to her chest. "What are you doing?" Daniel muttered under his breath, watching as the woman stepped onto the dirt road. She hesitated, glancing back at the car, then looked around quickly, as if making sure no one was watching. With a shaky motion, she placed Liam carefully on the ground. Liam's tiny figure looked so small on the screen, sitting on the dusty track as the woman whispered something to him. Then, without turning back, she hurried through the fence and climbed into the car. The vehicle's tires kicked up dust as it disappeared out of view, leaving Liam alone. The room fell silent as the footage ended. Daniel leaned back in his chair, feeling as though the wind had been knocked out of him. The officers said nothing at first, clearly processing the same heartbreak Daniel felt. "Why would she do that?" one of the detectives finally asked, his voice low and uncertain. Daniel's eyes lingered on the blank screen. "I don't know, but she didn't look cruel. Desperate, maybe, like she thought she had no choice." Liam's quiet voice broke the silence. "Mommy." Daniel turned sharply to see the little boy staring at the laptop screen, his big tear-filled eyes locked on the frozen image of the woman. He didn't sob or scream. Instead, he whispered the word like it was a fragile secret, clinging to some faint memory of love. Daniel's heart clenched painfully. He crouched down next to Liam, placing a gentle hand on the boy's small shoulder. "Was that your mommy, buddy?" Liam nodded slowly, his lower lip trembling. The officers exchanged looks, one of them stepping forward. "We'll run the license plate and put out a notice. Maybe we can find her and figure out what's going on." Daniel nodded absently, his focus still on Liam. The boy had been left in the middle of a wildlife reserve, an incredibly dangerous decision. And yet Daniel couldn't shake the woman's tender kiss, the way she lingered for just a moment before leaving him behind. What had pushed her to do this? Hours passed as the officers made their calls and filled out reports, leaving Daniel to care for Liam. The boy had warmed up slightly, now perched on Daniel's lap as he quietly ate a small sandwich. Daniel's thoughts drifted to King. The lion's behavior still baffled him, but there was no denying what had happened. King had seen Liam, recognized his helplessness, and protected him, not unlike how Daniel had once saved the lion as a cub. "It's like you knew, didn't you?" Daniel muttered to himself, shaking his head in disbelief. "You knew he needed someone to look out for him." Liam looked up curiously. "Lion?" he asked, his voice small. Daniel smiled softly. "Yeah, the lion. His name's King. He's a good guy, don't you think?" Liam grinned, his tiny hands mimicking claws as he whispered, "Roar." Daniel couldn't help but laugh. The sound was a much-needed relief after the emotional weight of the day. For a moment, it felt as though the two of them were sharing a quiet, private moment of hope, a fragile bond forming in the aftermath of chaos. The room fell into a deep silence as night settled over the Seren Wildlife Reserve. Outside, the sounds of nocturnal animals carried on the cool breeze, distant howls, the rustle of leaves, and the occasional roar of a lion. Inside the ranger station, Daniel sat at his desk, a cup of cold coffee in his hand, his eyes flicking from the quiet officers to the small boy curled up on a chair. Liam was fast asleep now, his face relaxed under the soft blanket Daniel had found for him earlier. The oversized blue jacket he wore had slipped off his small shoulders, making him look even smaller, so vulnerable it broke Daniel's heart. The two officers were seated on the far side of the room, flipping through their notes. One of them, Detective Carter, sighed and leaned back in his chair. "We've put out alerts. No word yet on his parents. The license plate from the car is registered to a nearby town, but the vehicle hasn't been spotted since. It's like they vanished into thin air." Daniel's jaw clenched. "So what happens to Liam now?" Carter glanced at him with tired eyes. "Child Services will take him in. If we can't find his family, he'll go to a local shelter or foster care until a permanent home is found." Daniel's heart dropped. The thought of Liam, this fragile, innocent boy, being passed through a system that didn't know him, didn't care for him the way he deserved, felt impossible to accept. "He's been through enough already," Daniel said quietly, staring at Liam's sleeping form. "Why put him through more?" "Look, I get it," Carter replied, his voice softening. "But we don't have a choice. That's how it works. He needs to be somewhere safe." Safe. The word echoed in Daniel's mind. He thought of King earlier that day, the massive lion who had inexplicably protected Liam, who had stood as a barrier between the boy and danger. Safe was what the lion had made Liam feel. Safe was what the child needed now, too. Daniel took a slow breath, weighing the unspoken thought that had been building in his chest all day. It felt crazy, reckless even, but he couldn't shake it. "Let me take him," Daniel said suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. Carter frowned. "Take him where?" "Here with me," Daniel replied firmly, his gaze unwavering. "At least for now, until you find his family or figure out what's going on. I'll take care of him." The room fell silent. The other officer looked up, surprised, while Carter narrowed his eyes skeptically. "Daniel, that's not how this works. You're a wildlife ranger, not a social worker." "I know," Daniel said, his voice steady. "But I've raised something helpless before. I know what it takes to keep someone alive." Carter rubbed his temples. "You're talking about lions, Daniel. Not a 3-year-old kid." Daniel crossed his arms, determination etched on his face. "Does it matter? The principle is the same. Someone took care of Liam his whole life until today. He's been left behind, abandoned, just like King was when I found him as a cub. If I hadn't stepped in back then, King wouldn't have made it. And now, years later, that same lion saved this boy's life. Don't you see? It's like things came full circle." The detective stared at him for a long moment, as if searching for a sign that Daniel was joking, but Daniel's face was serious, his eyes filled with a quiet, unshakable resolve. "I'm not saying forever," Daniel added, softening his tone. "Just let him stay here until you have answers. I can give him stability for now, a place to feel safe." Carter sighed, glancing at Liam. The little boy shifted in his sleep, letting out a quiet breath that tugged at everyone's hearts. Finally, the detective leaned forward, his voice low. "You know what you're signing up for, right?" Daniel nodded. "I do." "All right," Carter said reluctantly. "We'll make arrangements for Liam to stay with you, for now. But this isn't permanent, Daniel. If his family turns up or if the Child Services Department says otherwise, you'll have to let him go." "I understand," Daniel replied, though deep down, he already felt the beginnings of something stronger, something he couldn't yet name but knew he couldn't ignore. As the officers packed up and prepared to leave, Daniel moved over to the chair where Liam still slept. Kneeling beside him, Daniel gently brushed a lock of hair away from the boy's face. "You're not alone anymore," he whispered softly, echoing the words he had once spoken to King so many years ago. Liam stirred slightly but didn't wake. Daniel scooped him up into his arms, cradling the boy's small form against his chest. The weight felt natural, as though Liam somehow belonged there. The officers said their goodbyes and the door to the office clicked shut behind them, leaving Daniel and Liam alone. The ranger let out a long breath, glancing around the small, dimly lit room. He had no idea how to care for a child, what to feed him, how to comfort him if he cried, or how to handle the million questions that would come in the days ahead. But he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't let Liam go through this alone. That night, Daniel laid a makeshift bed on the couch in his cabin, tucking Liam in gently beneath a warm blanket. The boy opened his eyes for a moment, staring up at Daniel sleepily. "Lion?" Liam whispered. Daniel smiled softly. "Don't worry. King's out there watching over you." The boy's lips curved into a faint smile and he drifted back to sleep. Hours later, Daniel stood on the porch of his cabin, gazing out into the moonlit reserve. The world was alive with the sounds of the wild. Crickets chirping, owls hooting, and somewhere in the distance the low, rumbling roar of a lion. Daniel smiled faintly. "Thank you, King," he murmured into the night. Out in the darkness, beyond the reach of the porch light, a golden figure moved silently through the grass. King, the mighty lion, paused for a moment, his amber eyes reflecting the soft glow of the moon as he gazed toward Daniel's cabin. For a brief second, it was as if the two shared a silent understanding. Then, with a quiet flick of his tail, King turned and disappeared into the wilderness, leaving the ranger and the boy to face their new chapter together. The dawn came softly to the Sarin Wildlife Reserve, its light creeping over the endless plains and filtering through the trees. The reserve stirred to life. Birds called to one another in the crisp air, while the far-off growls of lions echoed across the wild expanse. Inside Daniel's cabin, the quiet hum of life began anew. Daniel woke up to the sound of small footsteps padding across the wooden floor. Blinking the sleep from his eyes, he sat up on the couch to see Liam standing near the window, his tiny hands pressed against the glass as he peered outside. The little boy looked mesmerized by the view. Golden grass shimmering in the early light, the distant silhouettes of giraffes wandering across the horizon. Daniel smiled softly, though the reality of the situation weighed on him. He had no experience caring for a child, and yet here Liam was, now his responsibility, at least for the time being. Daniel rubbed his eyes and stretched, his voice gentle as he called out, "Good morning, buddy. You slept well?" Liam turned toward him, his bright eyes wide with curiosity. He didn't say anything at first, but then nodded shyly. "Lion?" Liam asked, his small voice breaking the silence. Daniel chuckled as he stood up, ruffling Liam's messy hair. "King? He's out there somewhere. Don't worry, he's doing his rounds, keeping an eye on things." The boy smiled faintly, clearly reassured. In the small kitchen, Daniel busied himself with breakfast, trying to piece together what little he knew about feeding kids. His cupboards weren't exactly stocked with child-friendly food, but he managed to find bread, eggs, and a bit of fruit. "Let's see how you feel about scrambled eggs," Daniel muttered to himself as he cracked eggs into a pan. Behind him, Liam quietly explored the cabin, his tiny hands trailing over the edges of books and framed photos. One photo in particular caught his eye. He tugged at Daniel's shirt, holding it up. "What's this?" Liam asked, his voice small and curious. Daniel glanced down and smiled faintly. The photo was worn, its edges curled with age, But the image was still clear. A younger Daniel crouching in the grass, holding a tiny lion cub in his arms. The cub's fur was golden, its eyes large and wary as it peered into the camera lens. "That's King," Daniel explained softly, crouching down beside Liam. "When I found him, he was just a baby, like you. His mom was gone, and he didn't have anyone to look after him. So I brought him here, and I took care of him until he got strong enough to live on his own." Liam stared at the photo for a long moment before looking up at Daniel. "You helped him?" "Yeah," Daniel replied, his voice warm. "And now, he's one of the strongest lions in the reserve." The little boy smiled, hugging the photo to his chest as though it brought him comfort. As the morning sun climbed higher, Daniel decided to take Liam on a short drive through the reserve. It would give him a chance to check on things while helping Liam get some fresh air. Strapping the boy into the passenger seat of the Jeep, Daniel handed him a small pair of binoculars. "Keep your eyes open, okay? You might see something cool." Liam nodded eagerly, his face lighting up with excitement as the Jeep rolled out onto the dusty path. The wind whipped gently through their hair, carrying the sounds of the wild, the rustle of trees, the distant calls of animals, and the ever-present hum of the reserve coming alive. They didn't have to drive far before Liam gasped, his small voice bursting with excitement. "Look!" Daniel followed Liam's pointing finger to see a herd of zebras grazing nearby, their striped bodies blending into the landscape like ripples of shadow and light. Liam pressed the binoculars to his face, giggling as he marveled at the animals. "Zebras," he squealed. Daniel grinned. "Yeah, they're pretty cool, huh?" Liam nodded, his joy infectious. For the first time since Daniel had found him, the boy seemed carefree, his earlier fears temporarily forgotten. A few minutes later, Daniel slowed the Jeep near a small watering hole where several elephants had gathered, their massive forms casting long shadows on the ground. Liam's eyes widened as he watched the gentle giants spray water over their backs, their trunks moving with surprising grace. "Wow," Liam whispered, utterly captivated. Daniel watched the boy closely, his heart swelling. It was remarkable to see the reserve, the place he had spent so much of his life, through Liam's fresh eyes. It reminded him of why he had dedicated himself to this land, to these animals. For Daniel, the reserve was home, and now it seemed as though Liam was starting to feel that too. By midday, they had looped back to a quieter part of the reserve where lions were often spotted. Daniel parked the Jeep and pointed to a distant clearing. "Keep your eyes open," he said softly. "King might be out there." Liam's face lit up at the mention of the lion's name, and he pressed the binoculars eagerly to his eyes. For a moment, all was still. Then Daniel saw it, a golden figure emerging from the tall grass, his mane shimmering in the sunlight. "Look, Liam," Daniel whispered. "That's King." Liam gasped, his voice barely above a whisper. "Lion." King moved slowly, his powerful frame moving with the grace and confidence of a ruler in his kingdom. When the lion reached the edge of the clearing, he paused, turning his head to gaze directly at the Jeep. Daniel held his breath. It was as though King knew they were there, as though he recognized them even from a distance. Liam waved shyly through the window. "Hi, Lion." To Daniel's amazement, King let out a low rumbling sound, not a roar, but something softer, almost like an acknowledgement. The lion lingered for a moment longer before turning and disappearing back into the grass. Daniel exhaled, a smile tugging at his lips. "He's saying hello," he said softly to Liam. The boy beamed, his face filled with wonder. That night, back at the cabin, Liam lay curled up in a nest of blankets while Daniel sat nearby sipping a cup of tea. The little boy was finally starting to relax, though Daniel knew there were still questions that needed answering, about Liam's parents, about why he'd been abandoned. But for now, the boy was safe. As Liam drifted off to sleep, Daniel whispered softly, "Don't worry, buddy. I'll look out for you." From outside, in the stillness of the night, the faint rumble of a lion's roar echoed across the reserve. Daniel smiled faintly, feeling a quiet reassurance settle over him. King was still out there watching over them. And Daniel? He would do the same for Liam no matter what it took. The next few days passed in a blur of routines and small moments of connection. Daniel quickly adjusted to life with Liam, though the transition wasn't without its challenges. The boy was naturally shy and hesitant, clinging to Daniel's side as though afraid he might disappear too. Yet little by little, trust began to grow between them. Daniel found joy in introducing Liam to the wonders of the Suren Wildlife Reserve. Each day they explored the vast wilderness, spotting zebras, giraffes, and elephants. Liam's laughter became a regular sound in the Jeep as he pressed the binoculars tightly to his face, calling out whenever he saw something exciting. But it wasn't just the animals that fascinated Liam. He was particularly enchanted by King, the lion who had saved his life. Daniel often found the boy flipping through old photos of King as a cub or gazing out the cabin window at night, whispering, "Lion." Daniel didn't mind. He understood the bond Liam felt toward King. After all, the lion had become a protector in a way few could comprehend. One morning, as the sun painted the horizon in hues of pink and gold, Daniel received a call from Detective Carter. Daniel stepped out onto the porch of the cabin, his heart sinking as he listened to the detective's somber tone. "We've done everything we can," Carter said, "but it looks like Liam's parents are gone. No family has come forward, and we haven't been able to track down the car or its owners. Child Services is preparing to place him in an orphanage." Daniel felt the world tilt beneath him. He glanced back into the cabin where Liam sat at the table, quietly drawing a picture of King. "An orphanage?" Daniel repeated, his voice tight. "It's the next step," Carter said. Unless you're willing to pursue guardianship." Daniel's pulse quickened. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying the boy needs someone who understands him, someone he trusts," Carter replied. "And from what I've seen, that person is you." The rest of the day passed in a haze. Daniel couldn't stop thinking about the detective's words. Becoming Liam's guardian would be a monumental responsibility, one Daniel wasn't sure he was ready for. His life had always revolved around the reserve, the animals, and the vast wilderness he called home. Raising a child was an entirely different world. But then he thought of Liam's laughter as they watched the lions together. He thought of the way the boy clung to him when he was scared, and how his eyes lit up every time King appeared in the distance. That evening, Daniel sat across from Liam, who was munching on a peanut butter sandwich. "Hey, buddy," Daniel said softly, leaning forward. Liam looked up, his wide eyes curious. "How would you feel about staying here with me?" Daniel asked, his voice gentle. Liam tilted his head, his small brow furrowing in thought. After a moment, he nodded, a small smile breaking across his face. "Lion too?" he asked. Daniel laughed, ruffling the boy's hair. "Yeah, King too." The following weeks were a whirlwind of paperwork, interviews, and visits from social workers. Daniel threw himself into the adoption process with the same determination he had once used to care for King as a cub. It wasn't easy. There were endless questions to answer, evaluations to pass, and moments of doubt when Daniel wondered if he was making the right decision. But every time he looked at Liam, every time the boy smiled at him or reached for his hand, he knew he couldn't let him go. The reserve staff rallied around Daniel, offering their support in any way they could. His colleagues brought over supplies, toys, and clothes for Liam, transforming the ranger's cabin into a home fit for a child. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the day came when Daniel was officially declared Liam's legal guardian. The moment was bittersweet, marked by relief, joy, and the quiet understanding that life would never be the same. To celebrate, Daniel took Liam on a special drive through the reserve. The boy sat eagerly in the passenger seat, holding his favorite set of binoculars. As they approached a familiar clearing, Daniel slowed the Jeep. There, basking in the late afternoon sun, was King. The lion lay sprawled in the grass, his golden mane rippling softly in the breeze. Liam pressed his face to the window, grinning from ear to ear. "Lion!" he exclaimed. Daniel smiled, his heart swelling with pride and gratitude. He stopped the Jeep, letting them sit quietly and watch the majestic creature who had brought them together. "Do you want to know a secret about King?" Daniel asked softly, glancing at Liam. The boy turned to him, his eyes bright with curiosity. "One day I'll tell you the whole story," Daniel said. "About how I found him when he was a baby, just like you. About how he grew up strong and brave and how he saved your life." Liam nodded solemnly as though he understood the importance of the tale. For a while they sat together in comfortable silence, watching as King stretched lazily and glanced toward the jeep. His amber eyes seemed to hold a quiet wisdom, as though he knew his role in their story wasn't over yet. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery shades of orange and pink, Daniel turned the jeep back toward the cabin. Liam chattered happily about the animals they had seen, his small voice filling the air with excitement. Back at the cabin, Daniel tucked Liam into bed, sitting beside him until the boy drifted off to sleep. The room was quiet except for the soft sound of Liam's breathing and the faint hum of crickets outside the window. Stepping onto the porch, Daniel looked out at the vast reserve, his heart full. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a deep sense of purpose. He thought of King, of Liam, and of the unexpected way their lives had intertwined. Love, Daniel realized, came in many forms, often in the most unexpected ways. And for both Liam and King, Daniel would do whatever it took to keep them safe. In life, family isn't always something we're born into. Sometimes it's something we create through love, understanding, and the willingness to protect one another. Daniel had once saved a helpless lion cub, and years later, that same lion returned the favor by saving a little boy. It was a reminder that even in the wild, acts of kindness and bravery can echo across time, shaping lives in ways we never expect. This story is a testament to the power of second chances and the strength found in unexpected connections. Whether human or animal, love and courage have the power to heal and unite us all. If this story moved you, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and join us for more heartwarming tales of hope, resilience, and the extraordinary bonds that connect us all. Let's share these moments together and continue to celebrate the beauty of life. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.